Somewhere in the ruins of a German city, in the autumn of 1944, an American soldier presses his back against a cracked plaster wall and listens. On the other side of that wall, close enough that he can hear boots grinding on broken glass, a German defender is waiting for him. The stairwell is black, the air tastes of brick dust and cordite, and in the soldier's hands is a weapon that looks like it was swept off the floor of an auto repair shop. A crude steel tube, a folding wire stock, a magazine hanging off the bottom like an afterthought. There is no polish on it, no craftsmanship, nothing about it that says it belongs anywhere near a fight for your life. Men had laughed at this thing. They called it the grease gun, because it looked exactly like the tool a mechanic uses to pump grease into an engine. Some of them thought it was a joke, a cheap toy punched out of sheet metal by the same company that stamped headlamps for automobiles. To eyes trained on finely machined rifles, it looked like something the enemy would have no reason to fear. But in a room this small, at a distance, you could measure in footsteps. That ugly little tube was about to settle an argument that no amount of fine engineering could win. This is the story of the American M3 submachine gun, the weapon everyone mocked, and the savage room-by-room battle for the city of Aachen. To understand why anyone would put such a crude weapon into a soldier's hands in the first place, you have to understand what came before it. For years, the pride of the American close combat arsenal had been the Thompson. The Tommy gun, the same weapon that gangsters had made famous in the streets of Chicago a decade earlier. It fired a heavy .45 caliber pistol round. It was carved from solid steel and walnut, and soldiers loved it. It felt like a real weapon. It felt like something a craftsman had built. But there was a problem, and the problem was money. The Thompson was a nightmare to manufacture. Every one of them had to be carefully machined from blocks of steel, part by skilled workers on expensive tooling. In a world war that was swallowing weapons by the millions, the army simply could not make Thompsons fast enough or cheaply enough to arm everyone who needed one. So the Ordnance Department went looking at what the rest of the world was doing. The Germans had the MP-40, a simple stamped submachine gun that armed their infantry and their tank crews. The British, with their factories under bombardment, had produced the Sten, a weapon so crude and so cheap that some soldiers joked it was assembled from bicycle parts. Both weapons proved the same uncomfortable lesson. In the close quarters of a modern war, you did not need a beautiful gun. You needed a lot of guns, right now, in a lot of hands. Therefore, the army made a decision that offended every gunmaker's sense of pride. It asked for a weapon designed not to last a lifetime, but to be built by the hundreds of thousands, used hard, and thrown away when it broke. The job went to a designer named George Hyde and to the guide lamp division of General Motors, a factory whose normal work was pressing out automobile headlight housings. On the 12th of December, 1942, the Army adopted their creation. Officially, it was the United States submachine gun, caliber .45 M3. To the men who would carry it, it was the grease gun, and the name stuck for the rest of the century. Almost everything about it was designed to be cheap. The body was two halves of stamped sheet steel, welded together down the middle like a tin can. It had a simple wire stock that slid in and out. There were no fine tolerances, no hand fitting, no gleaming wood. The whole weapon cost the government somewhere around $20 to build, which was roughly half the price of even a simplified wartime Thompson. Before the war ended, the factories would turn out more than 600,000 of them. And the soldiers hated it, at least at first. Men who had trained on the machined M1 Garand rifle, the M1 carbine, and the beloved Thompson looked at this stamped steel tube and felt insulted. It looked flimsy. It felt flimsy. The early version had an awkward cranking handle on the side to cock it, and that handle was one of the weakest points in the whole design. To a rifleman who took pride in his weapon, being handed a grease gun felt like being told his life was worth about $20. But here is where the mockery started to run into reality. That crude little weapon had some very real virtues, and they were exactly the virtues that mattered when the fighting came in close. It was compact. With the wire stock pushed in, it was short enough to swing around inside a vehicle, down a trench, or through a doorway. That made it a natural choice for tank crews and drivers and paratroopers, men who needed firepower but had no room for a long rifle. It fired the same fat .45 caliber slug as the Thompson, a round that hit like a hammer at close range and knocked men off their feet. And it had one quirk that turned out to be a gift in tight spaces. It fired slowly. Where many submachine guns emptied their magazines in a panicked blur, the grease gun fired at only about 450 rounds a minute, a heavy, deliberate thumping rhythm. That slow rate made it easier to control, easier to aim in bursts, and easier to keep from wasting every bullet in the first half-second of a fight. There was one more thing the grease gun had going for it, and it was the very quality its crude looks disguised. Because it was so simple, with so few moving parts and so little inside it to seize up, it kept working in conditions that would have choked a finer weapon. Mud, grit, and the powdered rubble of a bombed city did not stop it the way they stopped more delicate designs. A soldier could drop it, kick it, drag it through a cellar full of broken glass, and it would still fire. The men who built car parts for a living had, almost by accident, built a weapon that shrugged off exactly the kind of filth that a city fight throws at everything caught inside it. None of that mattered on a parade ground, where the grease gun would always look like the poor relation. It only mattered in one very specific kind of nightmare, the kind of fighting where you could not see the enemy until you were already in the same room. And in October of 1944, the American army walked straight into exactly that nightmare, in a place called Aachen. Aachen was not just another town on the map. It sat right on Germany's western border, tucked against the point where Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands nearly meet. More than 1,000 years earlier, it had been the seat of Charlemagne, the great emperor, and Germans regarded it as a cradle of their history. It was the first major city on internationally recognized German soil that stood in the path of the advancing Allies. And that made it a symbol, for both sides, far out of proportion to its size. For the Americans of the First Army, breaking into Aachen meant cracking the outer shell of the Siegfried Line and proving that the war could be carried onto German ground itself. For Adolf Hitler, losing the first German city was unthinkable. The order came down that Aachen was to be held to the last. Whatever the cost, whatever was left of it when the fighting was done, the task of taking the city fell to one of the most famous outfits in the United States Army, the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, named for the bold red numeral on their shoulders. Through late September and into October, American forces fought a grinding battle to encircle the city, closing a ring around it against fierce German counterattacks. By early October, the trap had nearly shut, and the moment had come to reach in and pull the city apart. The encirclement itself had been a battle within a battle. As the two American pincers strained to link up around the city, the Germans threw counterattack after counterattack at the closing gap, desperate to keep a corridor open and feed reinforcements in. Fresh German units hurled themselves at the American lines on the high ground and in the villages around Aachen, and for days the outcome was genuinely in doubt. Only when the ring finally snapped shut, sealing the garrison inside, could the Americans turn their full attention to the city itself. On the 10th of October, the Americans sent in an ultimatum: surrender the city, or watch it be destroyed. The German commander refused, flatly and without hesitation. So the methodical destruction began. The men who would do most of the close work were the soldiers of the 26th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel John Seitz. The regiment had only 2 of its 3 battalions available for the job. The 3rd Battalion was sent to seize the high ground on the northern edge of the city. And into the dense heart of Aachen itself, into the tangle of stone apartment blocks and narrow streets, went the 2nd Battalion, commanded by a lieutenant colonel named Daniel. Daniel understood something important about the fight in front of him, and it shaped everything that followed. He knew he did not have enough men to trade lives with the defenders, house for house, in a fair fight. The German garrison in the city numbered somewhere around 5,000 men when the assault began, dug into cellars and upper floors and rubble, waiting. If Daniel sent his infantry charging down open streets against that, they would be slaughtered. So he decided he would not fight fair. He would let firepower do the dying wherever he possibly could. His philosophy was blunt, and he summed it up in 3 words: knock them all down. Rather than send riflemen into buildings the enemy still held, Daniel would first pound those buildings with everything he had. He layered his artillery like a curtain across the city, dropping mortar and light artillery just ahead of his men, medium artillery a little further out, and heavy artillery and bombs deep behind the German positions to seal the sector off so the defenders could neither be reinforced nor escape. The assault into the city opened on the 13th of October. It began, as almost every day would begin, with fire. Air attacks and artillery hammered the blocks ahead. Then Daniel's infantry moved. He had organized his battalion into 3 hard-hitting company task forces, and he had loaded each of them with far more than rifles. Every rifle company went in reinforced with tanks or tank destroyers, with 57mm anti-tank guns, with extra bazooka teams, with a flamethrower, and with heavy machine guns. This was not a rifle unit walking into a town. It was a mobile wrecking crew built to take a city apart one wall at a time. And the tactics they used were as grim and as clever as anything in the war. The great enemy in city fighting is the street. The moment a man steps into the open, he can be cut down from a dozen windows at once. So the Americans learned, block by bloody block, to stay out of the streets entirely. Instead of walking down them, they went through the buildings. Engineers and infantry would blast a hole through the wall of one building into the next, a technique the soldiers called mouse-holing, and then simply move from house to house through the gaps, never once showing themselves outside. Where the walls were too thick to breach, they turned to their heaviest tool of all. They brought up a self-propelled howitzer, a monstrous 155mm gun mounted on tracks, and they rolled it right into the streets to fire at point-blank range. Its shells weighed nearly 100 pounds each. Fired directly into the face of an apartment building from a block away, a single round could punch clean through stone walls the older buildings were famous for, opening a doorway where the enemy thought they were safe. The howitzer would tear the hole. The infantry would pour through it. It was slow, deliberate, and merciless, but even the biggest gun in the army could not finish the job. Sooner or later, a man still had to step through that smoking hole in the wall, into a dark room he could not see, where an enemy might be waiting 3 feet away. And that is where the whole grand machine of tanks and howitzers and artillery came down to the thing in the soldiers' hands. This was the grease guns' war. Not the parade ground, not the rifle range, but the stairwell and the cellar and the shattered kitchen. The Americans learned to clear a building the hard way, working through it floor by floor and room by room. They tossed a grenade in first, let it do its work, and then came in behind the blast with a submachine gun already firing. In that confined space, everything the rifleman had sneered at suddenly turned into an advantage. The grease gun was short enough to swing around a doorframe. Its heavy .45 caliber slugs did not need to travel far. Its slow, controllable rhythm meant a man could hose down a small room in disciplined bursts instead of emptying his magazine into a wall in one terrified instant. Nobody in that stairwell cared that the weapon had been stamped out of sheet metal for $20. They only cared that it worked, that it was in their hands, and that it kept firing. Where they could manage it, the Americans preferred to take a building from the top down rather than the bottom up. Fighting upward into a defended stairwell meant climbing blind into an enemy who could fire down the steps at leisure, so whenever a route to an upper floor could be found, over a roof, up a neighboring building, through a shell hole, they would clear from the top and drive the defenders downward, floor by floor, until the enemy had nowhere left to go but the cellar. Then came the grenades, and then the men behind them. It was exhausting, claustrophobic, terrifying work, repeated in building after building, and there was no clever shortcut through it. There was only the next room and the weapon in your hands. The Germans fought back with everything the city gave them. They knew Aachen far better than the attackers did, and they used it. They slipped through the sewers beneath the streets, popping up behind the American advance to fire into their backs, forcing Daniel to order every cellar cleared and every sewer opening sealed as his men went. They connected rooms and basements with tunnels so they could fall back through the walls, just as the Americans came in through them. Snipers waited in upper floors. Machine guns covered the rubble of the intersections. Every block had to be bought. The sheer volume of it tells you what kind of fighting this was. Over the course of the battle, Daniel's single battalion fired something on the order of 5,000 mortar rounds. It burned through more than 40,000 rounds of .30 caliber machine gun ammunition. It threw more than 4,000 hand grenades and fired tens of thousands of small arms rounds, along with dozens of gallons of flamethrower fuel. That is the arithmetic of clearing a city house by house. That is what it took to move a few hundred yards. None of those numbers, though, capture what it was actually like. Picture it from the inside. A squad of men crowded into a ruined room, plaster dust hanging in the air, ears still ringing from the last blast, staring at a hole freshly torn in the wall in front of them. On the other side, silence, or the scrape of a boot, or nothing at all until the shooting starts. One man tosses a grenade through the gap. The others wait the endless second for it to go off. Then they go through, firing, into a space they have never seen, hoping the men who were standing there a moment ago are no longer able to fire back. Then they do it again, and again. For days. Slowly, brutally, it worked. The Americans ground inward through the city, collapsing buildings on top of defenders, sealing off the sewers, taking apartment blocks one gutted room at a time. The German garrison shrank. By the middle of October, the commander of the city, a colonel named Gerhard Wilk, who had taken charge of the defense, had only a fraction of his original force still fighting. Perhaps 1,100 soldiers and a handful of police, hemmed into an ever smaller pocket. He kept broadcasting defiant messages, insisting the city would hold. It could not. His final command post was in the basement of a grand hotel called the Quellenhof, a building on the north side of the city that his men defended fiercely to the end. American infantry closed in on it, blasting and burning their way forward, until there was almost nothing left to defend and nowhere left to go. On the 21st of October, 1944, Gerhard Wilk finally surrendered what remained of Aachen. Roughly 3,500 German prisoners were marched out of the wreckage of Charlemagne's city. Aachen had fallen. It was the first major German city captured by the Allies, and the news of it rippled far beyond the ruined streets. The shell of the Reich had been cracked, and everyone on both sides understood what that meant. For the Allied soldiers slogging toward Germany, it was proof that the border was not a wall but a door, and the door had just been forced open. For the German High Command, it was a wound to the myth of the impregnable homeland. The very myth Hitler had ordered defended to the last man precisely because he understood how much it was worth. And for the exhausted infantry of the Big Red One, it was simply the end of one more impossible job, paid for in a currency they had come to know far too well. But the cost had been terrible, and honesty demands that we look at it plainly. The wider battle to take Aachen cost the American army more than 7,000 casualties, with around 2,000 men killed. The close fight for the city itself cost Daniels and the neighboring battalion dozens of dead and hundreds of wounded, 75 men killed and more than 400 wounded in those two battalions alone. The Germans lost thousands more, killed or captured, and the city, the ancient seat of an emperor, was left a corpse of itself. By the time the guns went quiet, something close to 85% of Aachen lay in ruins. There were no real winners in those streets, only the men who walked out and the men who did not. And now, the honest word about that grease gun. It did not clear Aachen. No single weapon did. Aachen was cleared by artillery and tanks, by that huge howitzer firing point blank, by bazookas and flamethrowers and hand grenades, by engineers with explosives and by ordinary men with rifles, all of it directed by a commander who refused to waste his soldiers where a shell could be spent instead. The grease gun was one tool among many, but it was the tool that fit the last and most terrifying moment of every fight, the moment a man stepped through a hole in a wall into the dark, and it did that job as well as anything the army owned. That is the quiet vindication of the whole ugly design. The cheap gun, the throwaway gun, the one the riflemen were embarrassed to carry, turned out to be exactly what the worst kind of fighting demanded. And the army noticed. The improved version, the M3A1, came along late in that same year, fixing the weak cocking handle by letting a soldier simply pull the bolt back with his finger. In that stripped-down form, the grease gun refused to die. It went on serving American tank crews for decades, through Korea, through Vietnam, and beyond, long after the beautiful Thompson had been retired to museum cases and movie sets. The weapon built to be thrown away became one of the longest-serving of its kind in American history. There is something worth sitting with in that. We tend to admire the things that look impressive, the polished machine, the elegant design, the weapon that gleams. And the men who first held the grease gun judged it exactly that way, by how it looked, and found it wanting. But a city like Aachen does not care how anything looks. It only asks one question, over and over, in every dark doorway. Does it work when everything is on the line and the enemy is an arm's length away? For the grease gun in the ruins of Charlemagne's city, the answer came back yes. The men who fought there are almost all gone now, and the weapons they carried sit silent behind glass. But the streets of Aachen were real, and so was every room they had to clear, and so was the fear of stepping through a broken wall, not knowing what waited on the other side. Those men deserve to be remembered as more than a footnote about an odd-looking gun. They deserve to be remembered for what they actually did, which was to walk into the first city of an enemy that had sworn to hold it forever and to take it apart with their own hands. If stories like this one matter to you, the forgotten weapons and the brutal human battles where they were truly tested, then stay with me. There are so many more of these stories waiting, the overlooked tools and the ordinary soldiers who proved them, and I would be glad to have you along as we uncover the next one. Subscribe and let us keep bringing these forgotten pieces of history back into the light, one story at a time.